everyone. I think we'll get started and others will join in as they can. Hi, my name is Debbie Anderson, and I want to extend a very warm welcome to each of you here this evening. This is the second in our series, Journeys to Justice, which is sponsored jointly by the affirming committees of Claremont and Goodwood United Churches. Our featured guest speaker tonight is Rev Junia Joplin, who is with Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto. But before I turn this over to our moderator, I want to acknowledge that we need to protect and honor the history and the people of the lands that we inhabit, the lands that surround us. May we all acknowledge the history, spirituality, and cultures of the first peoples of these lands, and may we work towards reconciliation and towards fulfillment of our treaty obligations. And let's start with a prayer. Creator God, source of compassion and love, bless all who are gathered here tonight to listen and learn. Bless us so that our words and actions may be one in unity, and with good hearts walk hand in hand to face the future. We pray this in all the names of Jesus. Amen. And now I'll turn this over to Reverend Lionel Ketela, who is our moderator for tonight.
Good evening. I'm Lionel Ketela, the minister of both Goodwood United Church and Claremont United Churches. And I'm very excited to be here hosting this evening or moderating, and very as well excited about the work of the affirming committees of both congregations who have put together this wonderful event. And also thank you to my husband, Steve, who is being our technical guy this evening. So thank you, Steve, for helping this all stay together. So it's a privilege for me to be able to introduce our guest tonight, Reverend Junia Joplin. Born and raised in North Carolina, Reverend Joplin was ordained as a Baptist pastor in 2007 and came to Canada in 2014. She's currently serving as Associate Pastor of Programs and Congregational Care at the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto. Reverend Joplin experienced a very public break with her previous church after coming out as a transgender woman in June 2020 during a live stream sermon, which offered a powerful message of love and acceptance, a message very badly needed, especially in the world of queer Christianity. In her ministry as pastor of MCC Toronto, Reverend Junia draws her inspiration from her own life story, with the hopes that she can help young transgender youth reconcile their faith and their spirituality. Shortly after her coming out, Reverend Junia lost her job after a congregational vote at the church where she was serving. And her coming out story and subsequent dismissal attracted worldwide media attention. And since that time, she's become a much sought after speaker and preacher. Reverend Junia is past recipient of the Canada 150 Community Leader Award and was recognized as one of the 2021 Women of Influence for her message of love and acceptance needed by many in the world of queer Christianity. And so Junia, it's a pleasure to have you here with us, and thanks for the opportunity to welcome you this evening.
Oh my goodness. Still being muted after almost 19 months or however long it is. Well, thank you so much. Grace and peace, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be with you all here tonight. And, speaking of North Carolina, one of the big things that's on my mind this week, among other things, Trans Day of Remembrance is coming up. This is Trans Awareness Week. Sunday, I'm going to be preaching a sermon at MCC Toronto, and shortly after I deliver that sermon, I'm going to jump in my car and drive down to the States and see my family for the first time since I've come out and transitioned. And so this time next week, I'll be hanging out with my mom for the first time as her daughter is June, and I'm, just kind of a bundle of nerves, but I'm glad to be with you all here tonight ahead of that. So I don't know if you're the praying type, but I know a lot of you probably are. If you could say just a word for that reunion, and we'll see how it goes. So, before the Pulse nightclub shooting back in 2016, which a lot of us remember painfully, the deadliest massacre of queer people in US history had been a fire set at the upstairs lounge in New Orleans, Louisiana on June the 24th, 1973. Some of you may be familiar with that occurrence, that story. The upstairs lounge on that afternoon was the site of a gathering of an MCC congregation under the leadership of Pastor Bill Larson. Officially, they still don't know how the fire started or who started the fire. They have some ideas about it, but 32 people were killed and another 15 injured. And it was just a terrible tragedy that decimated that faith community in the early days of the MCC community. Reverend Elder Troy Perry, the man who founded the MCC denomination back around 1968 in his living room in Los Angeles, made an emergency trip to New Orleans to help preside at a mass memorial service, a funeral for all the folks that were lost. And this being the early 1970s, there were a lot of folks involved in that MCC congregation and in MCC congregations all over the place. And in fact, in like LGBTQ community hubs all over that just didn't want people to know. Anonymity was a big part of the community in those days because discrimination was worse than it is now. It took the community a pretty long time to find a local church that was willing to even host this memorial service. And eventually, Reverend Perry and others found a local Methodist church there in New Orleans that said, yes, you can use our space. This became a big deal. And, as is sometimes the case, the media got involved and there were news trucks waiting outside the church as this funeral service, this memorial service, celebration of all these beautiful lives that were lost was wrapping up. Reverend Perry was at the podium and he realized, you know what, there are probably a lot of folks here, a lot of young gay men here, other LGBTQ plus folks who would like to be anonymous, who don't want to be identified, don't want to be on camera, probably don't want folks to know. One of the really tragic stories to come out of this, the whole story is tragedy, but the pastor of the church, Bill Larson, his mother didn't know he was gay, wouldn't receive his remains after the massacre. And that was the kind of world this was. And so Reverend Perry up at the pulpit said, if you don't want to be seen, folks, if you want to remain anonymous, there's a back door you can go out of. There's a way you can get out of the church so that the media cameras won't be turned to you. Not one soul that day went out the back door. I read that story just a couple of weeks ago in a course I'm taking to get my ordination credentials transferred to the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches. When I got to that part of the story, I kind of teared up. When I think about my own story, which is certainly not nearly as dramatic as anything like the upstairs lounge fire. That instance of Reverend Perry presiding at that funeral and the refusal of all those folks to go out the back door feels kind of metaphorical or emblematic of my journey. My journey towards coming out and being out has been one where I've just refused to go out the back door as often as possible. Because I believe that visibility really matters. For those of you who know a thing or two about the struggle, the ongoing struggle for queer rights in North America and around the world, you know that visibility matters. All you need to do is think about the role that visibility played in events like the Stonewall riots, or a couple of years before Stonewall, there was another set of riots in San Francisco called the Compton's Cafeteria riots, where a group of trans women got into a fight with the police because the police were arresting them for no good reason. Some of you here in Canada remember that all the visibility associated with responses to the bathhouse raids back in the early 1980s, which in so many ways was the Stonewall of Canada. Some of you probably remember how about 20 years ago, as folks at the Metropolitan Community Church in Toronto led the charge towards getting same-sex marriage recognized here in Canada. They did it in a very visible way, in a way that they refused to go out the back door. I was reading about that just a couple days ago, and there were like 600 people present on the day that Reverend Brent Hawks, I think it was January 14th, 2001, sorry, that he presided at 2 weddings at once, 2 women and 2 men, in what became some of the world's first legalized same-sex weddings. And he did it very intentionally, visibly. And, you know, so visibility matters. And you get trans folks together and ask us, when was the first time you saw another trans person that was living their lives happily, and what a huge impact that had on you? Visibility matters. And it's not just, you know, it's not just about LGBTQ plus people. Visibility matters in a lot of other ways too. In my coming out sermon, I told the story that was passed along to me by one of my mentors, Dr. Cecil Sherman, who was the first executive director of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship down in the States, and led a faction of moderate to liberal Baptists to kind of fight against the more conservative element in the old Southern Baptist Convention. I could talk about Baptist denominational history all evening, and you would all just, you know, that's not what I'm here for. But before he got involved in Baptist denominational controversies, Dr. Sherman was the pastor from about 1964 to 1983 or so of the First Baptist Church of Asheville, North Carolina, a really lovely little city close to where I grew up. And when he started pastoring at First Baptist Asheville, the membership was all white, and the bylaws of the church were designed so that Black people couldn't join the church. And there wasn't really an article in the bylaws that said Black people can't join the church, but there was an article that said that everybody had to be voted in unanimously, and the membership in those days wouldn't have voted unanimously to receive a Black church member. And so Dr. Sherman set to change that. And the reason he set to change that is because on one of the first Sundays that he was serving as the pastor of First Baptist Asheville, a Black woman, a local school teacher, had just moved to Asheville from Charlotte, North Carolina, walked down the center aisle during the invitation, which I don't, you know, that's a thing that Baptists in the South do, an invitation hymn and an altar call, and this woman walked down the aisle, and Dr. Sherman said, you know, I don't think they're going to let you join the church, but I'll fight for you. And he spent the next 10 years fighting very visibly to desegregate his church. But it all kind of started because of the visibility of that woman. Carol Cheney was her name. I think about the story of the church that I served when I was 19. I got my first paycheck from a church back when I was 19 years old. I got a job as a youth minister at a little church in my hometown there in the foothills of the mountains of Western North Carolina. And like a lot of Baptist churches in my area, they were fairly conservative on most things, but they allowed a little bit of wiggle room in the area of women in ministry. And I think the main reason to hear people talk that they had gotten to the place they did with women in ministry wasn't because they spent a lot of time, you know, studying the scriptures together or debating the theology of it together or anything like that. It was just that there was a little girl named Regina who grew up in the church, and at a certain point when she was in youth group said, you know, I think that God is calling me to be a pastor. And the folks of that little church there in Western North Carolina, you know, the theory, the idea, the hypothetical situation where women might or might not be pastors was one thing to them, but this flesh and blood little girl that grew up in the church was another thing. And so her visibility helped to change that church. And I will say, you know, my own theological journey from a, you know, fundamentalist Christianity and where I grew up to where I am now, that church was a big part of it. It didn't change me dramatically, but it just modified my trajectory a few degrees. I don't know where y'all are in your faith journeys, but you know, those slight trajectory changes make a big difference. And that happened for me because of the visibility of this young woman who said, you know, I think God is calling me into ministry. She grew up and went away to a divinity school at Duke University and became an amazing chaplain, and the church, which might have otherwise never changed the way they did, supported her all along the way. honestly, I think it's a little bit of a miracle that 53 people in a Baptist church voted that they wanted me to be their pastor after I came out as a trans woman. And, it's one of those unfortunate things about church membership. I know there were plenty more than that 53 that would have voted to keep me in my old job at Lorne Park Baptist. There were folks who came to vote on the day of the ballot and learned that they weren't actual members, but I think it was kind of a miracle. That's one of the, I guess, unfortunate sidebars that gets lost in the story. So many folks throughout, I guess, our society, especially those kind of tuned into the way churches work, think of Baptists and they think of very, very conservative Christians. I know that's not always the case. I like to tell the story of Nancy Leddens, who made international news back in the 1970s when she had been a Roman Catholic priest when she transitioned. And of course, she never served as a Roman Catholic priest again. But when she did get back into ministry right around 1990, 1991, it was at Wedgwood Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. So there have literally been trans women serving in ministry for my entire life, and a lot of them in Baptist congregations. Believe it or not, there are one-off, really cool, progressive, welcoming and affirming Baptist congregations out there. They're just hard to find. I'm actually preaching in one on the 28th down in Richmond, Virginia. I'm excited about that. It's another story. But yeah, 53 members of a Baptist church here in the Toronto suburbs voted basically to have a trans woman as their pastor. Unfortunately, they lost by what, 5 votes or so, or yeah, something like that. I don't. By now I should probably have those numbers in my head, but I don't quite. In most places, that would be enough to keep your job. In fact, based on my understanding of my congregation, I was thinking to myself, okay, June, if you can get 50 votes, I think you're going to keep your job. And I did. I got 53, but more people voted than I thought. So I guess I'm not a very good politician. But I think the fact that those folks even. I will say this, if when I had showed up with the search committee back in 2014, I had presented myself as a trans woman, I probably wouldn't have gotten a single vote. But I spent 7 years getting to know people, loving people, being loved by people, doing weddings, doing funerals, visiting with folks, doing all the things that get you into the hearts and lives of your people. And so, the idea of someone being trans might have been hard for a lot of folks at Lorne Park, but for some of them, they could say, well, this is June and we know June and we love June. And so for a lot of folks, it was okay. And I think that visibility helped them. And sadly, it wasn't enough for me to stay. But now we're here. And so, visibility matters. Visibility is important. That resolution not to go out the back door. For trans people, visibility is kind of a two-edged sword. It's something that can encourage us. It's something that can help us. It's something that can certainly put us in a better place in terms of societally, but it can also make us vulnerable. Trans Day of Remembrance is coming up on Saturday, and every year we remember a couple hundred usually trans people that have been lost to transphobic violence over the course of the year. But as I came close to coming out, one of the things I resolved was that I didn't want to do it by walking out the back door. Like I said, I moved to Canada back in 2014. I came after serving about 7 years in my first church out of seminary, and wanted to be Baptist someplace outside the South. I think maybe my subconscious was just pulling me to a place where I could get a little bit more freedom to maybe figure out who I was. I would have said right up until I was about age 39 or so that I was a cisgender man who was really sad and who really wished that he'd been born a woman, but wasn't, because I didn't understand what it meant to be trans. And then in about 2017, I volunteered with my oldest son's hockey team as the team manager. I was in charge of the snack calendar. I was in charge of letting people know where the game was this weekend, or get your deposits in for the hotel for the tournament, all that stuff. And in order to volunteer with the kids, I had to take a webinar on understanding and respecting gender diversity in sport. it seems there was a trans boy named Jesse Thompson who had been made to change in a girls' locker room by his hockey coaches some years ago, and he sued the Ontario Hockey Federation and brought them up on human rights charges. He won, and as a result, all of us adult volunteers had to learn about gender identity in order to volunteer with kids hockey. I was amazed taking this webinar. I was thinking, gosh, Sunday school teachers should have to do this. Everybody that works with kids should have to do this. But also, as I was taking this, I said to myself, oh my goodness, June, like, I wouldn't have called myself June back then, but I was like, oh my goodness, you really ought to think long and hard about this, because this is telling you things that resonate with you in a particular way. And by the end of that hockey season, yeah, I was ready to admit that I wasn't a cisgender man. And so sometime around April of 2018, I was in my office at my church in Mississauga, and just in the toughest place, recognizing that this struggle has been going on too long. So I got in my car, I drove into the gay village of Toronto, right at Church and Wellesley, and I went to the Glad Day bookstore, and I was just, weeping as I walked in and said to a person standing at the cash register, I've had questions about my gender identity for most of my life, and I don't know what to do. What should I be reading? And so they made a couple of recommendations. They recommended, I don't think it's within arm's reach, but they recommended Janet Mock's book, Redefining Realness. I bought a couple other books that day. And they noticed that because I was so distressed, I might use some time talking to somebody else. So they said, the 519 is just up the block. You can talk to somebody there and they can maybe get you in to see a therapist. And so I did that. And that evening, my spouse, now ex-spouse, could see that something was really bugging me. And I don't know, for those of you who are married or have been married, you can kind of see when your partner is carrying some kind of heavy load. And that night, as we went to bed, she said, something's bugging you. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to talk about it. And she pushed and she pushed and she pushed. And eventually I just took a deep, deep breath and said, I have questions about my gender identity, and I think I've had them all my life. And her first response was really supportive and really loving. And I will say, I don't always like to talk about this part of the journey, but my now ex-wife has been loving and supportive, but she's straight and doesn't really care to be married to a woman, and that's okay. We're in an amicable place co-parenting our kids. Oh, somebody put in the chat, it's Redefining Realness by Janet Mock. I can drop it into the, oh gosh, I don't see it, but anyway, that's the book I bought. I'll drop it into the, anyway, so I became self-accepting. I started, taking steps towards, I guess, experimenting with feminine gender presentation, started building community, started talking to people, slowly coming out to people, got into therapy. And I realized transition is in my not too distant future. That's when I started thinking, what am I going to do? I'm a pastor. So much homophobia and transphobia in our world. Even as it kind of decreases in some corners, it seems to be kind of holding steady in some parts of the church. And this is going to be a big thing coming out to my church. And so I had to make a decision, when am I going to come out? And how am I going to come out? Started looking for stories of other trans ministers. And actually, I've been told that there are about 300 transgender clergy here in North America. I think the highest ranking of us right now is Bishop Megan Rourke, who's the bishop of a Lutheran synod in California and Nevada. And Megan is pretty amazing. They were on an episode of Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, or it's not called Queer Eye for the Straight Guy anymore. It's just Queer Eye. Sorry, I'm dating myself. So Megan made headlines when they were consecrated as bishop in the Lutheran church down in the States. But there's a lot of us out there, actually. And so if you go looking for trans clergy, you're going to find us. There are a handful of us here in Ontario, as a matter of fact. One of the things I started seeing in our stories is that there were stories of us coming out kind of by going out the back door. There were stories of trans women, pastors, who, in an effort not to rock the boat, in an effort to maybe protect themselves a little bit, in an effort to maybe protect their churches a little bit, came out discreetly, maybe to their church boards, and they mutually agreed to part company. I saw that story again and again and again, and something about that just didn't sit right with me. I was talking with some of my trans friends at the time, and kind of became convinced that that wasn't right for me. Incidentally, I helped convene a support group online through Zoom for transgender seminary students and clergy. And so about once a month, I talk to a group of folks that includes people who are where I was 2 or 3 years ago, people who are pastoring in churches all over, and who are trying to figure out how to come out as transgender to their congregations. And oh my goodness, like it kind of sort of opens up old wounds a little bit, but it's a thing that happens more often than I guess a lot of folks would expect. Ultimately, I decided I could not be complicit in my own marginalization. That's the thing that I've repeated again and again and again. I will not be complicit in my own marginalization. There's nothing about my being trans that disqualifies me from being a pastor, and so I'm not going to bow out on my own volition. And I said, because so often when it comes to stories of trans people and coming out, the priority in those stories is the comfort of the cisgender people around them. For years, it was really difficult to receive gender affirming care unless a doctor could look at you and say, you know what, you're going to pass so well, nobody's going to know you're trans. And so, yes, I'll put you on hormones. Yes, I will give you treatment. Yes, it's okay for you to be in society because you're not going to make people uncomfortable by looking at you or being around you. And so for years, the comfort of cis people was prioritized over the safety and visibility of trans people. I didn't want to be part of that story. My church was going through their 100th anniversary. My former church was founded, I guess there was like a committee meeting. Some of you who know a little bit about church history, could probably guess that it had to start with a committee meeting, but a group of people got together in May of 1919 to say, maybe we should start working on starting a church here in the Lorne Park neighborhood of Mississauga, Ontario. And by May of 1920, the church was there. They had their first official worship service. And so what we decided to do was have a 100th anniversary that followed that same trajectory. So it was to start in May of 2019 and culminate in May of 2020. Folks, I was diagnosed with gender dysphoria in May of 2019, like the week before the first Sunday of the celebration. And on that first Sunday of the celebration, I realized, whether this church wants to keep me or not, my coming out is going to be a big thing, and it's going to be a distraction from this celebration. So let's get through this. Let's get to May of 2020, and then maybe the next month, after we've thrown our confetti and blown up our balloons and celebrated and entered our second century, maybe I can say, okay, folks, here's a uniquely, 21st century thing that we can step into together. So we all know what happened in March of 2020 to kind of kick things sideways. I started planning to come out, and COVID came to kind of change things a bit. In the meantime, I was doing things. I was essentially kind of living a double life that was uncomfortable, but in some ways it was helpful. I'd started hormone therapy in 2019. I was making friends, some trans, some cis in Toronto. I was attending the Metropolitan Community Church occasionally on Sunday nights as myself. I was building a network of people who only knew me as June, and I used to refer to that as Team June, and I was building Team June. In May of 2020, we went online. And at first I thought, I don't know what this is going to mean for my coming out. But when it became clear that we were not going to be going back to church anymore, I said, well, that's good news because I don't have to dress like a boy anymore. So I effectively socially transitioned at the beginning of COVID. I would keep a dress shirt or a hoodie hanging on my office door and tie my hair back. And if my nails were painted, which they're in horrible shape right now, I would just make sure I kept my hands off screen. when I had to get on Zoom calls for the church. And after a couple of weeks of getting the hang of Zoom and live stream services, I said, this might actually be a fortuitous thing, because I might get to preach this sermon to a lot more people than just the people in my sanctuary. And what I realized is that my coming out sermon was not going to be a June saves her job sermon. If they wanted to keep me, they were going to keep me. If they didn't, they weren't. And I wasn't going to talk my way into it or out of it in that sermon. And so what I resolved to do was to say the things that I, as a young, repressed, closeted trans kid who was really deeply involved in her church youth group, would have needed to hear a pastor say. I'd been reading, there's another book I should drop in the chat, but it's called Beyond a Binary God, A Theology for Trans Allies by Tara Sowers. Tara is the mother of a trans kid, and she is an Episcopal Anglican priest down in, I think, Rhode Island or somewhere in New England. And in that book, she compared being trans and coming out as trans and the risks and the societal costs involved in coming out as trans to Jesus's parable of the precious pearl in the Gospel of Matthew. And the moment I read that, I said to myself, I think I know what my last sermon is going to be about. And so I set off to write this sermon that framed being trans both as something that was a treasure and something that was very costly. I had 2 laptops and 2 cameras set up on my desk that day, one that was connected to Lauren Park's Zoom and one that was live streaming on my YouTube channel. And, I had about 2 or 3 dozen friends and social media connections that were watching me come out in real time. But yeah, I resolved to not go out the back door, to do the thing that so few LGBTQ plus folks have gotten to do in their churches, and that's stand in front of everybody and say, this is who I am, this is who God made me to be, this is who God is calling me to be, and now the ball's in your court. You get to decide what you're going to do. and incidentally, you get to do it with everybody watching. I can remember, oh gosh, can't remember who the author was, which is just as well. I don't need to give you another book to chase and put in the chat, but I know there was a book I read in seminary that talked about being the church for the watching world. That was the subtitle, how to be being the church for the watching world. And I think so often when it comes to like church controversy and stuff like that, we try to pretend like we don't want people to see us, and I didn't want that to happen. I lost my job 5 weeks later, and the next week, and just about every week since, there's been a place to connect. The week after, I preached for my friend Elizabeth Lott, who's the pastor of St. Charles Avenue Baptist Church in New Orleans. The next week, I think I was at First Baptist Worcester, Massachusetts, and the next week I was at 2 different churches. I was at MCC Toronto for the first time as a guest preacher. I was at Woodbine Heights Baptist Church in East Toronto as a guest preacher. I've preached for, United churches all over Canada, which has been really fun. I really, really appreciate that connection and those invitations. And all along the way, it's been about visibility. Not because I love visibility. In fact, sometimes I really don't like it at all. What I often tell people is I came out as trans on June the 14th, 2020. And I had a photo shoot on June the 15th, 2020. And folks, that is not the way to do it. I do not recommend doing it that way. I can remember telling my friend Elizabeth from St. Charles Avenue Baptist, I said, I think this might make the denominational news, but it's not like it's going to be in the New York Times or anything. And then it was literally in the New York Times, my getting fired from Lauren Park. And there's still a little bit of media attention here and there. I was on the phone. I was on FaceTime or Zoom this morning with a producer from the BBC, BBC World. BBC is really not done right by trans people lately, and so I've been kind of feeling them out. They want to do a program on me that'll air in January, I think, and very, very cautiously, I'm kind of moving forward with that. So I don't know what to make of that, quite honestly. I'm always a little surprised when people ask after me and invite me to do things and to be in different places and make appearances. But I did have a friend on social media who's a trans woman and an activist in Utah, down in the States. And she said to me, you need to be ready to be on whatever the Canadian version of Good Morning America is. This was before I came out. And I thought about that for a bit. And she said, you know, you are white, you're mostly passable, you're pretty, you're a lot of things that cis people will be comfortable seeing on television. And so you need to know that. And I thought about that, and I thought about how those things are, those things are essentially privileges, and for those of us who recognize our privileges, I think there's this call to use them responsibly. And so I resolved that I, wanted to be visible in a way that helped our community and brought attention to important issues like religiously motivated transphobia. I love asking people what story from the Bible that they feel like they're living. It's one of my favorite questions. I'm giving a talk with the Affirming Ministry Network up near Sudbury on December the 1st, in fact, in about 2 weeks. And it's for Advent, and I'm going to be talking about how, as a trans woman of faith, I feel like I'm living some of Mary's story in a way. But for myself, I see a lot of myself in stories of healing in the scriptures. Especially in the Gospels, Jesus encounters these folks and they are transformed. There's the story of the possessed man in Gerasa. I think that's Matthew or Mark. And at the end of the story, the people see this person totally transformed. I think the text says like he's clothed and he's in his right mind, is the way he's described in the text. And nobody was used to seeing him that way. And if you know that story, when the people saw him that way, it really gave them the creeps. It disturbed them greatly. And in fact, they said to Jesus, you got to get out of here. We don't like this. Don't stop changing people. Even if the version of them that we knew was uncomfortable in its own way, we don't like change. And that poor guy said to Jesus, like, please take me with you. Because I think it's hard to step back into a community that knew you one way, a new way. And Jesus said, sorry, but you need to stay here and bear witness. And it's kind of in some ways, it's a bittersweet parting of companies in that story, but stories like that. Stories like in John chapter 11 and the resurrection of Lazarus, and how by John chapter 12, not only were people plotting to kill Jesus, but they were plotting to kill Lazarus too. People don't like change. They don't even like resurrection. People hate that stuff. And if we really look inside of ourselves, we recognize like we don't like that. We just, it's bad. But one of my favorites is the story from Mark chapter 2. At the beginning of Mark chapter 2, and I think some of us probably know it. It's a man who couldn't walk. 4 of his friends bring him to see Jesus. Jesus is in a house. The house is so full, nobody can get in. And so what do? They go up on the roof, tear the roof open, and they lower him down. I can remember like in Sunday school when I was a kid, like, my teacher brought like a towel and we took turns like being held by, it was probably very dangerous, but it was also the 1980s. And so that's what happened. There's a line in that story that shortly after I became self-accepting, shortly after I finally conceded that, I'm not just a sad man who wants to be a woman, I am actually a woman. I'm going to be transitioning. There's a line from that story that really just kind of jumped out at me and kind of like perched itself like a bird on one of the limbs of my soul. And that line is in front of everybody. Jesus raised him up And right away, he picked up his mat and walked out in front of everybody. And they were all amazed and praised God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." That's Mark chapter 2, verses just verse 12. And that phrase, "in front of everybody," I never noticed it before, but started thinking about the man's story and how, whether he had been unable to walk from birth or just unable to walk through an injury or an illness, he hadn't taken any steps for a very good while. And not only was he expected to get up and take his first very tentative, perhaps very difficult steps right then and there, but he had to do it in front of a whole audience of people. And folks, I don't know about you, but that's kind of a hard thing to do. I am constantly worrying over at MCC Toronto, especially now that I'm occasionally wearing high heels on Sunday mornings, that I'm just going to fall, like tumble right off the chancel as I'm going down. It's a tough thing to do. And as trans people, most of us can tell you about the first time that we went out as ourselves. For me, it was June the 13th, 2018, right at Church Wellesley down in the city. And I can remember taking the deepest, most anxious breath before I stepped out of my car, and like, there I was for the first time. It's terrifying. And in some ways, it's kind of scary to do it with a lot of people looking. And I feel like in some ways that's been what my transition has been. But I believe that visibility really matters. I believe that visibility has the power to change hearts and minds. One of the first books that I read back when I was kind of contemplating coming out and thinking about what that would look like, and here I'm going to give you another book, is just called God and the Gay Christian by Matthew Vines. At the very end of God and the Gay Christian, Matthew Vines writes about the Yale historian John Boswell, who was a gay Christian and church historian. And almost 40 years ago, he wrote about the role of personal witness in making the church more inclusive. And so Boswell was writing about the Gospel of John and drew meaning from the Greek word logos in John chapter 1, verse 1. And he suggested that the word logos could mean something like case or argument. A lot of us, and I don't know the biblical literacy level of the folks I'm talking to, but usually United Church folks are pretty good at it. Logos is often translated word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But Boswell said it could also be thought of as case or argument or even testimony. And so Jesus, who John describes as God's eternal word, God's eternal logos, is God's irrefutable case, God's undeniable testimony, God's argument to humankind. So Boswell kind of drew on that and said that the most powerful case that queer Christians can offer the church and the world is just the witness of their own lives. He said it's much harder for people to remain hostile to and unmoved by a living sibling, brother, sister, sibling, than it is to rail against an abstraction. Gay Christians, he wrote, and in 2021 we can say, LGBTQ plus, or however we style that, that broader community, including trans people like me. LGBTQ plus Christians are like the logos in this sense. We are arguments incarnated in persons who make our commitment, our lives, and our beings an unanswerable living statement of faithfulness and love. Now, I read those words. That was one of those things that told me visibility matters. Like, we can be a personal testimony. I've had that affirmed again and again and again. Like I said, I've just been studying the history of the Metropolitan Community Church denomination. And a couple of days ago, I had a long conversation with Reverend Brent Hawks, who's our pastor emeritus at MCC Toronto. And I was talking to him in particular about HIV/AIDS ministry. And I told him that as a kid, the thing I remember the most about the HIV and AIDS crisis was hearing my pastor talk about how the illness was somehow related to God punishing gay people for being gay. And that's terrible theology. And I asked him if, as a public theologian, he had to create a different narrative. He had to fight against that. And he said, some And he said, you know, my philosophy has often been that you never turn down a media interview. You always have to work to create this alternate narrative, because so many people think of Christianity as necessarily homophobic or necessarily transphobic, or they think of Christians as you know, not trans people, not gay, lesbian people, not bisexual people. And I think anytime we can show folks that, yeah, there's a different story, we can help rewrite those stories. And like I said, I think that matters. And we do that by not going out the back door. And yeah, I think that's what I've got for you tonight. So thanks.
Okay, Lionel, thank you so much, Reverend Junia, for the living argument, the incarnate argument of your story and your witness that you've offered us this evening. And Debbie Anderson will invite you to join us too. So we have an opportunity now. I'm aware we said we were going to commit to 8:30. If we have to stay longer for questions, you're welcome to remain with us. I have one to begin with. And during that question, I'd invite all of us to enter into chat any other questions that you would like to share or have me or Debbie ask during this time. So I guess what I thought I had two that sort of came to my mind as I heard you share, Junia. One was, I recall hearing during another media interview or a video where you shared the story of your name. It might have been your coming out sermon. And it was beautiful, and just as biblical arguments go, it was so powerful. So I wonder if you could please share that again.
Sure. Well, one of my favorite chapters of Romans is the last chapter of Romans. So, you know, St. Paul had never been to Rome when he wrote to the church at Rome. And so in the last chapter, he just says, say hey to everybody, say hey to Lionel, say hey to Debbie, say hey to June. And it's just this long list of names. And, you know, some folks would just gloss over that and think, well, that's kind of boring. I love thinking about the hidden lives of these people who are only mentioned in passing. And there's one person mentioned in chapter 16. Oh gosh, and I'm not going to find it just by looking at it. I should know this off the top. Oh, here she is. Romans 16 verse 7. Paul writes, "Say hello to Andronicus and Junia, my relatives and my fellow prisoners. They are prominent among the apostles, and they were in Christ before me." Okay, so Paul has just referred to this woman. This is a woman's name that's well attested in antiquity as outstanding among the apostles. And so a lot of translators of the scripture saw that, and they said, wait a minute, like there can't have been a woman apostle, and so let's masculinize that name. And so they put an S at the end of it, which in Greek or Latin turned it into a boy's name. The problem is that was not a real name. There were lots of women in antiquity named Junia. There was nobody named Junius. And I compare that to like seeing, you know, meeting minutes with, say, you know, the president of an organization named, I don't know, I can't think of a name that doesn't masculinize, but basically seeing a name like Claudia and saying, well, the president of the company can't have been named Claudia. That must be Claudio. And so like translators of the Bible literally changed the language to obscure the fact that this woman was being referred to as outstanding among the apostles. So Junia was a leader in the early church who in her own way has had to assert her femininity across the ages. And I love it so much. And it shortens to June, which, you know, folks tend to call me, and some people call me Junie, which I like too. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I loved the way you explored scripture and talked about how the scriptural narratives connect with your own experience and how you encourage people to look for the stories that they are living in. So, because I had a similar question for you actually, and it was throughout your journey, and I know this is a big question, but sort of highlight, who has God been for you?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. So I do a lot of processing when I'm out running, and I have not been running much lately, but I'll go out and run 3 to 5 miles, and that's 30 minutes to almost an hour that I just have to think. And I was out on a run once, and it occurred to me that when God called me into ministry, God was calling a woman into ministry, but I didn't know it. God knew that, but I didn't know that. And I like to think about the day that I was ordained in October of 2007, as this, congregation of people laid hands on me, in my own kind of, I don't know, maybe this is good theology, maybe it's a little anachronistic, but I like to think of God saying, you can call her whatever you want to today, but like today you're ordaining Junia. Like I said in my coming out sermon, I believe in a God who knows your name, even if you don't know what it is yet. I believe in a God that calls you a beloved daughter, even if your family says that you're their son. God created me the way I am. God has known me even before I knew myself, and that, gosh, that's been so reassuring. That thought occurred to me when I was out running, and I kind of had to just sit down on the curb and cry for a little bit because it was so moving. But my faith has kind of gone through ups and downs, and not only has God been that creator that knows me intimately, but I've really found a lot of comfort in the confession that God is love, from 1 John. The writer of 1 John could have said a lot of things about God. God is right belief. God is right practice. God is being in community. God is love. I think we need to reflect on what that means and what that looks like.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And all of those images. And
Thank
Debbie,
you. I've seen a question come up on the chat, Junia, that is, how do you decide who you will speak and or present your story to? Is there a decision process that you go through?
Yeah, well, it's not so much a matter of deciding. Sometimes it is, I think one of the most blatantly transphobic publications in, the Western world right now is The Guardian out of the UK. They're the only ones that I said, no, I'm not talking to you. I'm not going to do it. Because at the time I just said, maybe the most transphobic developed nation in the world right now is the UK, and I don't need more exposure in the UK. So, that's only happened maybe once. I've talked to a lot of people. I talked to Fox News. Like I knew that they were going to write a story about me, whether I talked to them or not. So in the end, it was just a matter of saying, okay, let me kind of set a few things straight. I wasn't super happy with the story they did, but again, they were going to do it one way or the other. Usually I just have a conversation with the producer or the reporter or whomever. Folks are overwhelmingly sympathetic, which is one of the really lovely things about the visibility, is it's kind of, in some ways, it's really shed a light on how out of touch religiously motivated transphobia is with where people are. But yeah, I just check in. Like I've been talking to this person with the BBC and saying, okay, here are the things that I don't want you to ask me about. Here are the things I'm not going to talk about. Here are the things that I don't want in the piece. And if you still want to do it, then that's fine. But you need to know these are my boundaries. And it's weird. There are enough. I have enough trans peers who have been in the media, including a number of trans clergy. We're still in an era where just being trans and being a pastor is seen as newsworthy. And so, like I said, you want to use the visibility well. And so folks can give you a little impromptu media training session and tell you it's okay to say no to people. And it's okay to set, the conversation I had with the BBC producer this morning was all about, okay, you're not going to ask me about this. This has no business being in the story you're doing. So yeah, I'll talk to you, but like, let's avoid that, stuff like that.
Thank you. And I see one other question here in the chat that asks, would you ever consider returning to the Baptist church?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know the chapter, but I know somewhere near the end of Acts where the narrative gets a little dry and Paul is up, he's on trial somewhere. Well, it's in Jerusalem because there's a bunch of Pharisees in the room, and he gets up and he says, brothers, I'm a Pharisee too. And this is like years after Damascus Road. And this man identified as a Pharisee for his entire life. MCC Toronto is full of gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans people who would say that they are still Catholic, but go to MCC, and like, Baptistness is so deeply embedded in me. And honestly, it's because I've learned so much about our history. In a way, Baptists introduced religious freedom to the world, and the idea that you can be whatever faith you want or no faith at all, and the king or the queen or whoever's in charge doesn't get to have a say in that. We're like I said, there are some of us that are really outliers in terms of being progressive. And when you can find a church like that, you found something pretty special. So yeah, maybe, I'm going to be preaching at the Baptist church that I attended during seminary, the first Sunday of Advent, November 28th, because I'm just going to happen to be in town. And so, I'm falling more and more in love with the MCC, not just the church in Toronto, but the wider denomination, but there'll always be a part of me that's still kind of Baptist. And maybe if the conditions were right. Yeah. In fact, in a way, being at MCC is lovely. It's a healing place for me. It's a place where and I'm not just talking about like sexual orientation or gender identity. It really is a church where folks can just be themselves. We have all kinds of cisgender straight people who just want to be in a place where it's okay to be themselves, like fully. And I feel like in so many of our churches, we feel the need to have this very carefully curated persona. And that's what I had for 30 years. I was never a man, but I knew how to be a man of God, because that's a very carefully curated persona that pastors have to be. And so it gave me a blueprint for how to exist in a world where I wasn't a man, but I had to pretend to be one. If I were in Baptist life again, it might not be that way. But in a way, like that kind of visibility and contrast might make a bigger difference than being in a church where there's so many, goodness gracious, I think there's a whole cohort of us trans women at MCC Toronto, and we kind of check in with each other. It's actually really lovely in a way, but it's also nice sometimes being in a place where you can kind of shine a light for folks, or not quite educate, but just bear witness in a community that hasn't had that.
Thank you so much. I want to say thank you for myself, but I think I speak for all of us when I say that it has been an absolute delight to have you with us. Your courage, your transparency and honesty. And I think that what I personally am going to be taking away are a couple of phrases that you have said that are going to stick with me, because not only do they relate to how you are living your life, but I think they have something to say to the rest of us as just more broadly as Christian, that visibility matters, and that we should not be complicit in our own marginalization, because visibility has the power to change hearts and minds. I just thank you so much for all that you have given us to think about, all that you have shown us about the power of being who you are and not being afraid to be it. Thank you so very much. Yes.
Yes, thank you. And as well, Reverend Junia, we wanted to wish you our blessings as you travel to be with family in North Carolina, and to think about you at that time. So you will be in our prayers.
Thank you.